Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, Vintage International, Christopher's Kindle. Chapter 4. The wheel felt like an alien thing in my hands as I followed the white line of the highway. Heat rays from the late afternoon sun arose from the gray concrete, shimmering like the weary tones of a distant bugle, blown upon still midnight air. In the mirror, I could see Mr. Norton, staring out vacantly upon the empty fields, his mouth stern, his white forehead livid where it had scraped the screen. And seeing him, I felt the fear bawled coldly within me unfold. What would happen now? What would the school officials say? In my mind, I visualized Dr. Bledsoe's face when he saw Mr. Norton. I thought of the glee certain folks at home would feel if I were expelled. Tatlock's grinning face danced through my mind. What would the white folks think who'd sent me to college? Was Mr. Norton angry at me? In the golden day, he had seemed more curious than anything else, until the vet had started talking wild. Damn Trueblood. It was his fault. If we hadn't sat in the sun so long, Mr. Norton would not have needed whiskey, and I wouldn't have gone to the golden day. And why would the vets act that way with a white man in the house? I headed the car through the red brick campus gateposts with a sense of cold apprehension. Now even the rows of neat dormitories seemed to threaten me, the rolling lawns appearing as hostile as the gray highway with its white dividing line. As of its own compulsion, the car slowed as we passed the chapel with its low, sweeping eaves. The sun shone coolly through the avenue of trees, dappling the curving drive. Students strode through the shade down a hill of tender grass toward the brick-red stretch of tennis courts. Far beyond, players in whites showed sharp against the red of the court surrounded by grass, a gay vista washed by the sun. In the brief interval, I heard a cheer arise. My predicament struck me like a stab. I had a sense of losing control of the car and slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road, then apologized and drove on. Here, within this quiet greenness, I possessed the only identity I had ever known, and I was losing it. In this brief moment of passage, I became aware of the connection between these lawns and buildings and my hopes and dreams. I wanted to stop the car and talk with Mr. Norton, to beg his pardon for what he had seen, to plead and show him tears, unashamed tears like those of a child before his parent, to denounce all we'd seen and heard, to assure him that far from being like any of the people we had seen, I hated them, that I believed in the principles of the founder with all my heart and soul, and that I believed in his own goodness and kindness in extending the hand of his benevolence to helping us poor, ignorant people out of the mire and darkness. I would do his bidding and teach others to rise up as he wished them to. Teach them to be thrifty, decent, upright citizens, contributing to the welfare of all, shunning all but the straight and narrow path that he and the founder had stretched before us. If only he were not angry with me. If only he would give me another chance. Tears filled my eyes, and the walks and buildings flowed and froze for a moment in mist, glittering as in winter when rain froze on the grass and foliage and turned the campus into a world of whiteness, weighting and bending both trees and bushes with fruit of crystal. Then in the twinkling of my eyes, it was gone, and the here and now of heat and greenness returned. If only I could make Mr. Norton understand what the school meant to me. "Shall I stop at your rooms, sir?" I said, "or shall I take you to the administration building? Dr. Bledsoe might be worried." "To my rooms. Then bring Dr. Bledsoe to me," he answered tersely. "Yes, sir." In the mirror, I saw him dabbing gingerly at his forehead with a crinkled handkerchief. "You'd better send the school physician to me also," he said. I stopped the car in front of a small building with white pillars like those of an old plantation manor house, got out and opened the door. "Mr. Norton, please, sir, I'm sorry. He looked at me sternly. His eyes narrowed, saying nothing. "I didn't know. Please?" "Send Dr. Bledsoe to me," he said, turning away and swinging up the graveled path to the building. I got back into the car and drove slowly to the administration building. A girl waved gaily as I passed, a bunch of violets in her hand. Two teachers in dark suits talked decorously beside a broken fountain. The building was quiet. Going upstairs, I visualized Dr. Bledsoe with his broad, globular face that seemed to take its form from the fat pressing from the inside, which, as air pressing against the membrane of a balloon, gave it shape and buoyancy. Old Buckethead, some of the fellows called him. I never had. He had been kind to me from the first, perhaps because of the letters which the school superintendent had sent to him when I arrived. But more than that, he was the example of everything I hoped to be, influential with wealthy men all over the country, consulted in matters concerning the race, a leader of his people, the possessor of not one, but 2 Cadillacs, a good salary, and a soft, good-looking, and creamy-complexioned wife. What was more, while black and bald and everything white folks poked fun at, he had achieved power and authority, had, while black and wrinkled-headed, made himself of more importance in the world than most Southern white men. They could laugh at him, but they couldn't ignore him. "He's been looking all over for you," the girl at the desk said. When I walked in, he looked up from the telephone and said, "Never mind, he's here now," and hung up. "Where's Mr. Norton?" he demanded excitedly. "Is he all right?" "Yes, sir. I left him at his rooms and came to drive you down. He wishes to see you." "Is anything wrong?" he said, getting up hurriedly and coming around the desk. I hesitated. "Well, is there?" The panicky beating of my heart seemed to blur my vision. "Not now, sir." "Now? What do you mean?" "Well, sir, He had some kind of fainting spell. Oh, my God, I knew something was wrong. Why didn't you get in touch with me? He grabbed his black Hamburg, starting for the door. Come on. I followed him, trying to explain. He's all over it now, sir, and we were too far away for me to phone. Why did you take him so far? He said, moving with great bustling energy. But I drove him where he wanted to go, sir. Where was that? Back of the slave quarter section, I said with dread. The quarters? Boy, are you a fool? Didn't you know better than to take a trustee out there? He asked me to, sir. We were going down the walk now, through the spring air, and he stopped to look at me with exasperation, as though I'd suddenly told him black was white. Damn what he wants, he said, climbing in the front seat beside me. Haven't you the sense God gave a dog? We take these white folks where we want them to go. We show them what we want them to see. Don't you know that? I thought you had some sense. Reaching Rab Hall, I stopped the car, weak with bewilderment. Don't sit there, he said. Come with me. Just inside the building, I got another shock. As we approached a mirror, Dr. Bledsoe stopped and composed his angry face like a sculptor, naked in a bland mask, leaving only the sparkle of his eyes to betray the emotion that I had seen only a moment before. He looked steadily at himself for a moment. Then we moved quietly down the silent hall and up the stairs. A co-ed sat at a graceful table stacked with magazines. Before a great window stood a large aquarium containing colored stones and a small replica of a feudal castle, surrounded by goldfish that seemed to remain motionless despite the fluttering of their lacy fins. A momentary, motionful suspension of time. Is Mr. Norton in his room? He said to the girl. Yes, sir. Dr. Bledsoe, sir, she said. He said to tell you to come in when you got here. Pausing at the door, I heard him clear his throat, then rap softly upon the panel with his fist. Mr. Norton, he said, his lips already a smile. And at the answer I followed him inside. It was a large, light room. Mr. Norton sat in a huge wing chair with his jacket off. A change of clothing lay on the cool bedspread. Above a spacious fireplace, an oil portrait of the founder looked down at me remotely, benign, sad, and in that hot instant, profoundly disillusioned. Then a veil seemed to fall. I've been worried about you, sir, Dr. Bledsoe said. We expected you at the afternoon session. Now it's beginning, I thought. Now. And suddenly he rushed forward. Mr. Norton, your head, he cried, a strange grandmotherly concern in his voice. What happened, sir? It's nothing. Mr. Norton's face was immobile, a mere scratch. Dr. Bledsoe whirled around, his face outraged. Get the doctor over here, he said. Why didn't you tell me that Mr. Norton had been injured? I've already taken care of that, sir, I said softly, seeing him whirl back. Mr. Norton, I'm so sorry, he groaned. I thought I had sent you a boy who was careful, a sensible young man. Why, we've never had an accident before. Never, not in 75 years. I assure you, sir, that he shall be disciplined, severely disciplined. But that was no automobile accident, Mr. Norton said kindly, nor was the boy responsible. You may send him away. We won't need him now. My eyes suddenly filled. I felt a wave of gratitude at his words. "Don't be kind, sir," Dr. Bledsoe said. "You can't be soft with these people." Romani. "We mustn't pamper them." Remember, he said it was ginger-colored. "An accident to a guest of this college while he is in the charge of a student is without question the student's fault. That's one of our strictest rules." Then to me, "Return to your dormitory and remain there until further notice." "But it was out of my control, sir," I said, just as Mr. Norton said. "I'll explain, young man," Mr. Norton said with a half smile. "Everything will be explained." "Thank you, sir," I said, seeing Dr. Bledsoe look at me with no change of expression. "On second thought," he said, "I want you to be in chapel this evening. Understand me, sir?" "Yes, sir." I opened the door with a cold hand, bumping into the girl who had been at the table when we went inside. "I'm sorry," she said. "Look like you have old Buckethead kind of mad." I said nothing as she walked beside me expectantly. A red sun cast its light upon the campus as I started for my dormitory. "Will you take a message to my boyfriend for me?" she said. "Who is he?" I said, trying hard to conceal my tension and fear. "Jack Maston," she said. "Okay. He's in the room next to mine." "That's swell," she said with a big smile. "The dean put me on duty, so I missed him this afternoon. Just tell him that I said the grass is green." "What?" "The grass is green. It's our secret code. He'll understand." "The grass is green," I said. "That's it. Thank you, lover," she said. I felt like cursing as I watched her hurrying back into the building, hearing her flat-heeled shoes crunching the graveled walk. Here she was playing with some silly secret code at the very minute my fate for the rest of my life was being decided. The grass was green, and they'd meet and she'd be sent home pregnant, but even so, in less disgrace than I. If only I knew what they were saying about me. Suddenly, I had an idea and ran after her, into the building and up the stairs. In the hall, fine dust played in a shaft of sunlight, stirred by her hurried passing, but she had disappeared. I thought to ask her to listen at the door and tell me what was said. I gave up. If she were discovered, I'd have that on my conscience too. Besides, I was ashamed for anyone to know of my predicament. It was too stupid to be believed. Down the long length of the wide hall, I heard someone unseen skipping down the stairs singing, a girl's sweet, hopeful voice. I left quietly and hurried to my dorm. I lay in my room and my eyes closed, trying to think. The tension gripped my insides. Then I heard someone coming up the hall and stiffened. Had they sent for me already? Nearby, a door opened and closed, leaving me as tense as ever. To whom could I turn for help? I could think of no one to whom I could even explain what had happened at the Golden Day. Everything was upset inside me. And Dr. Bledsoe's attitude toward Mr. Norton was the most confusing of all. I dared not repeat what he'd said. for fear that it would lessen my chances of remaining in school. It just wasn't true. I had misunderstood. He couldn't have said what I thought he had said. Hadn't I seen him approach white visitors too often with his hat in hand, bowing humbly and respectfully? Hadn't he refused to eat in the dining hall with white guests of the school, entering only after they had finished, and then refusing to sit down, but remaining standing, his hat in his hand, while he addressed them eloquently, then leaving with a humble bow? Hadn't he? Hadn't he? I had seen him too often as I peeped through the door between the dining room and the kitchen. I myself. And wasn't his favorite spiritual, Live a Humble? And in the chapel on Sunday evenings upon the platform, hadn't he always taught us to live content in our place in 1,000 unambiguous words? He had, and I had believed him. I had believed without question his illustrations of the good which came of following the founder's path. It was my affirmation of life, and they couldn't send me away for something I didn't do. They simply couldn't. But that vet, he was so crazy that he corrupted sane men. He had tried to turn the world inside out. God damn him. He had made Mr. Norton angry. He had no right to talk to a white man as he had, not with me to take the punishment. Someone shook me and I recoiled, my legs moist and trembling. It was my roommate. "What the hell, roomie?" he said. "Let's go to chow." I looked at his confident mug. He was going to be a farmer. "I don't have an appetite," I said with a sigh. "Okay now," he said. "You can try to kid me, but don't say I didn't wake you." "No," I said. "Who are you expecting? A broad-butt gal with ball-bearing hips?" "No," I said. "You better stop that, roomie," he grinned. "It'll ruin your health. Make you a moron. You ought to take a gal and show her how the moon rises over all the green grass on the founder's grave, man." "Go to hell," I said. He left laughing, opening the door to the sound of many footsteps from the hall. Supper time. The sound of departing voices. Something of my life seemed to retreat with them into a great distance. Moiling. Then a knock sounded at the door and I sprang up, my heart tense. A small student wearing a freshman's cap stuck his head in the door, shouting, "Dr. Bledsoe said he wants to see you down at Rab Hall." And then he was gone before I could question him, his footsteps thundering down the hall as he raced to dinner before the last bell sounded. At Mr. Norton's door, I stopped with my hand on the knob, mumbling a prayer. "Come in, young man," he said to my knock. He was dressed in fresh linen, the light falling upon his white hair as upon silk floss. A small piece of gauze was plastered to his forehead. He was alone. "I'm sorry, sir," I apologized, "but I was told that Dr. Bledsoe wanted to see me here." "That's correct," he said, "but Dr. Bledsoe had to leave. You'll find him in his office after chapel." "Thank you, sir," I said and turned to go. He cleared his throat behind me. "Young man?" I turned hopefully. "Young man, I have explained to Dr. Bledsoe that you were not at fault. I believe he understands." I was so relieved that at first I could only look at him, a small, silken-haired, white-suited St. Nicholas seen through misty eyes. "I certainly do thank you, sir," I managed finally. He studied me silently, his eyes slightly narrowed. "Will you need me this evening, sir?" I asked. "No, I won't be needing the machine. Business is taking me away sooner than I expected. I leave late tonight." "I could drive you to the station, sir," I said hopefully. "Thank you, but Dr. Bledsoe has already arranged it." "Oh," I said with disappointment. I had hoped that by serving him the rest of the week, I could win back his esteem. Now I would not have the opportunity. "Well, I hope you have a pleasant trip, sir," I said. "Thank you," he said, suddenly smiling. "And maybe next time you come, I'll be able to answer some of the questions you asked me this afternoon." "Questions?" His eyes narrowed. "Yes, sir, about your fate," I said. "Ah, yes, he said. "And I intend to read Emerson, too." "Very good. Self-reliance is a most worthy virtue. I shall look forward with the greatest of interest to learning your contribution to my fate." He motioned me toward the door. "And don't forget to see Dr. Bledsoe." I left somewhat reassured, but not completely. I still had to face Dr. Bledsoe, and I had to attend chapel. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Vintage International. Christopher's Kindle. Chapter 5. At the sound of vespers, I moved across the campus with groups of students, walking slowly, their voices soft in the mellow dusk. I remember the yellowed globes of frosted grass making lacy silhouettes on the gravel, and the walk of the leaves and branches above us as we moved slow through the dusk so restless, with scents of lilac, honeysuckle, and verbena, and the feel of spring greenness. And I recall the sudden arpeggios of laughter lilting across the tender springtime grass, gay, welling, far, floating, fluent, spontaneous, a bell-like feminine fluting, then suppressed, as though snuffed swiftly and irrevocably beneath the quiet solemnity of the vespered air, now vibrant with somber chapel bells. Dong, dong, dong. Above the decorous walking around me, sounds of footsteps leaving the verandas of far-flung buildings and moving toward the walks and over the walks to the asphalt drives lined with whitewashed stones. Those cryptic messages from men and women, boys and girls, heading quietly toward where the visitors waited. And we moved not in the mood of worship, but of judgment, as though even here in the flittering dusk, here beneath the deep indigo sky, here alive with looping swifts and darting moths, here in the here-ness of the night not yet lighted by the moon that looms blood-red behind the chapel, like a fallen sun, its radiance shedding not upon the here dusk of twittering bats, nor of the there night of cricket and whippoorwill, but focused, short-rayed upon our place of convergence, and we drifting forward with rigid motions, limbs stiff and voices now silent, as though on exhibit even in the dark, and the moon a white man's bloodshot eye. and I move more rigid than all the others with a sense of judgment. The vibrations of the chapel bells stirring the depths of my turmoil, moving toward its nexus with a sense of doom. And I remember the chapel with its sweeping eaves, long and low as though risen bloody from the earth like the rising moon. Vine-covered and earth-covered as though more earth sprung than man sprung, and my mind rushing for relief away from the spring dusk and flower scents, away from the time scene of the crucifixion to the time mood of the birth, from spring dusk and vespers to the high clear, lucid moon of winter and snow glinting upon the dwarfed pines, where instead of the bells, the organ and the trombone choir speak carols to the distances drifted with snow, making of the night air a sea of crystal water, lapping the slumbering land to the farthest reaches of sound. For endless miles, bringing the new dispensation even to the golden day, even unto the house of madness. But in the here-ness of dusk, I am moving toward the doom-like bells, through the flowered air, beneath the rising moon. Into the doors and into the soft lights I go, silently, past the rows of puritanical benches, straight and tortuous, finding that to which I am assigned and bending my body to its agony. There at the head of the platform, with its pulpit and rail of polished brass, are the banked and pyramided heads of the student choir. Faces composed and stolid, above uniforms of black and white, and above them, stretching to the ceiling, the organ pipes looming, a Gothic hierarchy of dull, gilded gold. Around me the students move with faces frozen in solemn mass, and I seem to hear already the voices mechanically raised in the songs the visitors loved, demanded. Song? An ultimatum accepted and ritualized. An allegiance recited for the peace it imparted, and for that perhaps loved, as the defeated come to love the symbols of their conquerors, a gesture of acceptance of terms laid down and reluctantly approved. And here, sitting rigid, I remember the evenings spent before the sweeping platform in awe and in pleasure. And in the pleasure of awe, remember the short formal sermons intoned from the pulpit there, rendered in smooth articulate tones, with calm assurance, purged of that wild emotion of the crude preachers most of us knew in our hometowns, and of whom we were deeply ashamed. These logical appeals which reached us more like the thrust of a firm and formal design requiring nothing more than the lucidity of unclustered periods, the lulling movement of multisyllabic words to thrill and console us. And I remember, too, the talks of visiting speakers, all eager to inform us of how fortunate we were to be part of the vast and formal ritual. How fortunate to belong to this family, sheltered from those lost in ignorance and darkness. Here upon this stage, the black rite of Horatio Alger was performed to God's own acting script, with millionaires come down to portray themselves, not merely acting out the myth of their goodness. And wealth and success and power and benevolence and authority in cardboard masks. But themselves, these virtues, concretely, not the water, not the wafer and the wine, but the flesh and the blood, vibrant and alive and vibrant even when stooped, ancient and withered, and who, in face of this, would not believe, could even doubt. As I remember, too, how we confronted those others, those who had set me here in this Eden, whom we knew though we didn't know, who were unfamiliar in their familiarity, who trailed their words to us through blood and violence and ridicule and condescension, with drawling smiles, and who exhorted and threatened, intimidated with innocent words as they described to us the limitations of our lives, and the vast boldness of our aspirations, the staggering folly of our impatience to rise even higher, who, as they talked, aroused furtive visions within me of blood froth sparkling their chins like their familiar tobacco juice, and upon their lips the curdled milk of a million black slave mammies, withered dugs, a treacherous and fluid knowledge of our being, imbibed at our source and now regurgitated foul upon us. This was our world, they said as they described it to us. This our horizon and its earth, its seasons and its climate, its spring and its summer, and its fall and harvest some unknown millennium ahead. And these its floods and cyclones, and they themselves are thunder and lightning. And this we must accept and love, and accept even if we did not love. We must accept, even when those were absent. And the men who made the railroads and ships and towers of stone were before our eyes, in the flesh, their voices different, unweighted with recognizable danger, and their delight in our songs more sincere seeming, their regard for our welfare marked by an almost benign and impersonal indifference. But the words of the others were stronger than the strength of philanthropic donors. But the words of the others were stronger than the strength of philanthropic dollars, deeper than shafts sunk in the earth for oil and gold, more awe-inspiring than the miracles fabricated in scientific laboratories. For their most innocent words were acts of violence to which we of the campus were hypersensitive, though we endured them not. And there on the platform I too had striven and debated, a student leader directing my voice at the highest beams and farthest rafters, ringing them, the accents staccato upon the ridge-pole and echoing back with a tinkling, like words hurled to the trees of a wilderness, or into a well of slay gray, or into a world of slate gray water, more sound than dense, a play upon the resonance of buildings, an assault upon the temples of the ear. Ha! To the gray-haired matron in the final row. Ha! Miss Susie Gresham, back there looking at that co-ed smiling at the he-ed. Listen to me, the bungling bungler of words, imitating the trumpet and the trombone timbre, playing thematic variation like a baritone born. Hey, O connoisseur of voice sounds, of voices without messages, of newsless winds. Listen to the vowel sounds and the crackling dentals, to the low, harsh gutturals of empty anguish, now riding the curve of a preacher's rhythm. I heard long ago in a Baptist church, stripped now of its imagery, no suns having hemorrhages, no moons weeping tears, no earthworms refusing the sacred flesh and dancing in the earth on Easter morn. Ha! Singing achievement. Ha! Booming success intoning. Ha! Acceptance. Ha! A river of word sounds filled with drowned passions floating. Ha! With wrecks of unachievable ambitions and stillborn revolts sweeping their ears. Ha! Range stiff before me, neck stretched forward with listening ears. Ha! A spraying the ceiling and a drumming the dark stained after rafter, that seasoned cross-arm of tortuous timber mellowed in the tune of 1,000 voices, playing, ha, as upon a xylophone, words marching like the student band, up the campus and down again, blaring triumphant sounds empty of triumphs. Hey, Miss Susie, the sound of the words. Hey, Miss Susie, the sound of words that were no words. Counterfeit notes singing achievements yet unachieved. Riding upon the wings of my voice out to you, old matron, who knew the voice sounds of the founder and knew the accents and echo of his promise, your gray old head cooked with the young around you, your eyes closed, face ecstatic, as I tossed the word sounds in my breath, my bellows, my fountain, like bright-colored balls in a waterspout. Hear me, old matron, justified now this sound with your dear old nod of affirmation, your closed-eyed smile and bow of recognition, who'll never be fooled with the mere content of words. Content of words? Not my words, not these pen-feathered fighters, not these pen-feathered flighters that stroke your lids till they flutter with ecstasy with but the mere echoed noise of the promise. And after the singing and outward marching, you seize my hand and sing out quavering, boy, some day you'll make the founder proud. Ha! Susie Gresham, Mother Gresham, guardian of the hot young woman on the Puritan benches who couldn't see your Jordan's water for their private stream. You, relic of slavery, whom the campus loved but did not understand, aged of slavery, yet bearer of something warm and vital and all-enduring, of which in that island of shame we were not ashamed. It was to you on the final row I directed my rush of sound, and it was you of whom I thought with shame and regret as I waited for the ceremony to begin. The honored guests moved silently upon the platform, herded toward their high, carved chairs by Dr. Bledsoe, with the decorum of a portly head waiter. Like some of the guests, he wore striped trousers and a swallowtail coat with black braided lapels, topped with a rich ascot tie. It was his regular dress for such occasions. Yet for all its elegance, he managed to make himself look humble. Somehow his trousers inevitably bagged at the knee, and the coat slouched in the shoulders. I watched him smiling at first one and then another of the guests, of whom all but one were white, and as I saw him placing his hand upon their arms, touching their backs, whispering to a tall, angular-faced trustee, who in turn touched him familiarly, I felt a shudder. I, too, had touched a white man today, and I felt that it had been disastrous. And I realized then that he was the only one of whom I knew, except perhaps a barber or a nursemaid, who could touch a white man with impunity. And I remembered, too, that whenever white guests came upon the platform, he placed his hand upon them as though exercising a powerful magic. I watched his teeth flash as he took a white hand. Then, with all seated, he went to his place at the end of the row of chairs. Several terraces of students' faces above them, the organist, his eye glinting at the console, was waiting with his head turned over his shoulder, and I saw Dr. Bledsoe, his eyes roaming over the audience, suddenly nod without turning his head. It was as though he had given a downbeat with an invisible baton. The organist turned and hunched his shoulders. A high cascade of sound bubbled from the organ, spreading thick and clinging over the chapel, slowly surging. The organist twisted and turned on his bench, with his feet flying beneath him as though dancing to rhythms totally unrelated to the decorous thunder of his organ. And Dr. Bledsoe sat with a benign smile of inward concentration. Yet his eyes were darting swiftly, first over the rows of students, then over the section reserved for teachers, his swift glance carrying a threat for all. For he demanded that everyone attend these sessions. It was here that policy was announced in broadest rhetoric. I seemed to feel his eyes resting upon my face as he swept the section in which I sat. I looked at the guests on the platform. They sat with that alert relaxation with which they always met our upturned eyes. I wondered to which of them I might go to intercede for me with Dr. Bledsoe. But within myself I knew that there was no one. In spite of the array of important men beside him, and despite the posture of humility and meekness which made him seem smaller than the others, although he was physically larger, Dr. Bledsoe made his presence felt by us with a far greater impact. I remembered the legend of how he had come to the college, a barefoot boy who in his fervor for education had trudged with his bundle of ragged clothing across 2 states. And how he was given a job feeding slop to hogs, and how the founder had been impressed and made him his office boy. Each of us knew of his rise over years of hard work to the presidency, and each of us at some time wished that he had walked to the school or pushed a wheelbarrow or performed some other act of determination and sacrifice to attest his eagerness for knowledge. I remembered the admiration and fear he inspired in everyone on the campus, the pictures in the Negro press captioned "Educator" in type that exploded like a rifle shot. His face looked out at you with utmost confidence. To us, he was more than just a president of a college. He was a leader, a statesman who carried our problems to those above us, even unto the White House. And in days past, He had conducted the president himself about the campus. He was our leader and our magic, who kept the endowment high, the funds for scholarships plentiful, and publicity moving through the channels of the press. He was our cold, black daddy, of whom we were afraid. As the organ voices died, I saw a thin brown girl arise noiselessly with a rigid control of a modern dancer. High in the upper rows of the choir, and begin to sing a cappella. She began softly, as though singing to herself of emotions of utmost privacy, a sound not addressed to the gathering, but which they overheard almost against her will. Gradually, she increased its volume, until at times the voice seemed to become a disembodied hetif, force that sought to enter her, to violate her, shaking her, rocking her rhythmically, as though it had become the source of her being, rather than the fluid web of her own creation. I saw the guests on the platform turn to look behind them, to see the thin brown girl in white choir robes standing high against the organ pipes, herself become before our eyes a pipe of contained, controlled, and sublimated anguish, a thin, plain face, transformed by music. I could not understand the words, but only the mood, sorrowful, vague, and ethereal, of the singing. It throbbed with nostalgia, regret, and repentance, and I sat with a lump in my throat as she sank slowly down, not a sitting but a controlled collapsing, as though she were balancing, sustaining the simmering bubble of her final tone by some delicate rhythm of her heart's blood, or by some mystic concentration of her being, focused upon the sound through the contained liquid of her large uplifted eyes. There was no applause, only the appreciation of a profound silence. The white guests exchanged smiles of approval. I sat thinking of the dread possibility of having to leave all this, of being expelled, imagining the return home and the rebukes of my parents. I looked at the scene now from far back in my despair, seeing the platform and its actors as though a reversed telescope, small doll-like figures moving through some meaningless ritual. Someone up there, above the alternating moss-dry and grease-slick heads of the students, rode before me, was making announcements from a lectern on which a dim light shone. Another figure rose and led a prayer. Someone spoke. Then around me everyone was singing, lead me to a rock that is higher than I." And as though the sound contained some force more impervious than the image of the scene of which it was the living connective tissue, I was pulled back to its immediacy. One of the guests had risen to speak, a man of striking ugliness, fat, with a bullet head set on a short neck, with a nose much too wide for its face, upon which he wore black lensed glasses. He had been seated next to Dr. Bledsoe, but so concerned had I been with the president that I hadn't really seen him. My eyes had focused only upon the white men and Dr. Bledsoe. so that now, as he arose and crossed slowly to the center of the platform, I had the notion that part of Dr. Bledsoe had arisen and moved forward, leaving his other part smiling in the chair. He stood before us relaxed, his white collar gleaming like a band between his black face and his dark garments, dividing his head from his body. His short arms crossed before his barrel, like a black little Buddha's. For a moment he stood with his large head lifted as though thinking. Then he began speaking, his voice round and vibrant as he told of his pleasure in being allowed to visit the school once more after many years. Having been preaching in a northern city, he had seen it last in the final days of the founder, when Dr. Bledsoe was the second in command. Those were wonderful days, he droned. Significant days, days filled with great portent. They were. As we talked, he made a cage of his hands by touching his fingertips. Then, with his small feet pressed together, he began a slow, rhythmic rocking, tilting forward on his toes until it seemed he would fall, then back on his heels, the lights catching his black lens glasses until it seemed that his head floated free of his body and was held close to it only by the white band of his collar. And as he tilted, he talked until a rhythm was established. Then he was renewing the dream of our hearts. This barren land, after emancipation, he intoned. This land of darkness and sorrow, of ignorance and degradation, where the hand of brother had been turned against brother, father against son, and son against father, where master had turned against slave and slave against master, where all was strife and darkness, an aching land. And into this land came a humble prophet, lowly like the humble carpenter of Nazareth, a slave and a son of slaves, knowing only his mother, a slave born, but marked from the beginning by a high intelligence and princely personality, born in the lowest part of this barren, war-scarred land, yet somehow shedding light upon it wherever he passed through. I'm sure you have heard of his precarious infancy, his precarious life almost destroyed by an insane cousin who splashed the babe with lye and shriveled his seed, and how, a mere babe, he lay 9 days in a death-like coma and then suddenly and miraculously recovered. You might say that it was as though he had risen from the dead or been reborn. "Oh, my young friends," he cried, beaming, "my young friends, it is indeed a beautiful story. I'm sure you've heard it many times. Recall how he came upon his initial learning, through shrewd questioning of his little masters, the elder masters never suspecting, and how he learned his alphabet and taught himself to read and solve the secret of words, going instinctively to the Holy Bible with its great wisdom for his first knowledge. And you know how he escaped and made his way across mountain and valley to that place of learning, and how he persisted and worked noontimes, nights and mornings for the privilege of studying, or as the old folk would say, of rubbing his head against the college wall. You know of his brilliant career, how already he was a moving orator, then his penniless graduation, and his return after years to this country. And then his great struggle beginning. Picture it, my young friends, the clouds of darkness all over the land, black folk and white folk full of fear and haste, full of fear and hate, wanting to go forward, but each fearful of the other. A whole region is caught in a terrible tension. Everyone is perplexed with the question of what must be done to dissolve this fear and hatred that crouched over the land like a demon waiting to spring. And you know how he came and showed them the way. Oh, yes, my friends, I'm sure you haven't heard it. I'm sure you've heard it time and time again of this godly man's labors, his great humility, and his undimming vision, the fruit of which you enjoy today. Concrete made flesh. His dream, conceived in the starkness and darkness of slavery, fulfilled now ever in the air you breathe, in the sweet harmonies of your blended voices, in the knowledge which each of you, daughters and granddaughters, sons and grandsons of slaves, all of you partaking of it in bright and well-equipped classrooms. You must see this slave, this black Aristotle, moving slowly with sweet patience, with a patience not of mere man, but of God-inspired faith. See him moving slowly as he surmounts each and every opposition, rendering unto Caesar that which was Caesar's, yes, but steadfastly seeking for you that bright horizon which you now enjoy. All this, he said, spreading his fingers palm down before him, has been told and retold throughout the land, inspiring a humble but fast rising people. You have heard it, and this true story of rich implication, this living parable of proven glory and humble nobility, and it, as I say, has made you free. Even you who have come to this shrine only this semester know it. You have heard his name from your parents, for it was he who led them to the path, guiding them like a great captain. Like that great pilot of ancient times who led his people safe and unharmed across the bottom of the blood-red sea. And your parents followed this remarkable man across the black sea of prejudice, safely out of the land of ignorance, through the storms of fear and anger, shouting, "Let my people go," when it was necessary, whispering it during those times when whispering was wisest. And he was heard. I listened, my back pressing against a hard bench, with a numbness, my emotions woven into his words as upon a loom. And remember how, he said, when he entered a certain state at cotton-picking time, his enemies had plotted to take his life. And recall how during his journey he was stopped by the strange figure of a man whose pitted features revealed no inkling of whether he was black or white. Some say he was a Greek, some a Mongolian, others a mulatto, and others still a simple white man of God. Whoever and whatsoever, and we must not rule out the possibility of an emissary directly from above. Oh, yes, and remember how he appeared suddenly, startling both founder and horse as he gave warning, telling the founder to leave the horse and buggy there in the road and proceed immediately to a certain cabin, then slipped silently away. So silently, my young friends, that the founder doubted his very existence. And you know how the great man continued through the dusk, determined though puzzled as he approached the town. He was lost, lost in reverie until the crack of the first rifle sounded, then the almost fatal volley that creased his skull. Oh my! And left him stunned and apparently lifeless. I have heard him tell, with his own lips, how consciousness returned while they were still upon him examining their foul deed, and how he lay biting his heart lest they hear it and wipe out their failure with a coup de grace, as the French would say. Ha! And I'm sure you've each of you lived with him through his escape, he said, seeming to look directly into my watered eyes. You awakened when he awakened, rejoiced when he rejoiced at their leaving without further harm, arising when he arose, seeing with his eyes the prints of their milling footsteps and the cartridges dropped in the dust about the imprint of his fallen body. Yes, and the cold dust encrusted but not quite fatal blood. And you hurried with him full of doubt to the cabin designated by the stranger, where he met that seemingly demented black man. You remember that old one, laughed at by the children in the town square, old, comic-faced, silly-faced, crafty, cotton-headed, and yet it was he who bound up your wounds with the wounds of your founder, he, the old slave, showing a surprising knowledge of such matters. Germology and scabology, ha, he called it. And what a youthful skill of the hands! For he shaved our skull, and cleansed our wound, and bound it neat with bandages stolen from the home of an unsuspecting leader of the mob. Ha! And you recall how you plunged with the founder, the leader, deep into the black art of escape, guided at first, indeed initiated, by the seemingly demented one who had learned his craft in slavery. You left with the founder in the black of the night, and I know it. You hurried silently along the river bottom, stung by mosquitoes, hooted by owls, zoomed by bats, buzzed by snakes that rattled among the rocks. Mud and fever, darkness and sighing. You hid all the following day in the cabin, where 13 slept in 3 small rooms, standing until darkness in the fireplace chimney, back in all the soot and ashes. Ha! Guarded by the granny who dozed at the hearth seemingly without a fire. You stood in the blackness, and when they came with their baying hounds, they thought her demented, but she knew the fire. She knew the fire. She knew the fire that burned without consuming. My God, yes, a woman's voice responded, adding to the structure of his vision within me. And you left him on the morning, hidden in a wagon load of cotton, in the very center of the fleece, where you breathed the hot air through the barrel of the emergency shotgun. The cartridges, which thank God it was unnecessary to use, held fanwise and ready between the spread fingers of your hand. And you went into this town with him and were hidden by the friendly aristocrat one night, and on the next by the white blacksmith, who held no hatred, surprising contradictions of the underground, escaping, yes, helped by those who knew you and those who didn't know, because for some it was enough to see him. Others helped without even that, black and white. But mostly it was our own who aided, because you were their own, and we have always helped our own. And so, my young friends, my sisters and brothers, you went with him, in and out of cabins, by night and early morning, through swamps and hills, on, past from black hand to black hand, and some white hands, and all the hands molding the founder's freedom, and our own freedom, like voices shaping a deep felt song. And you, each of you, were with him. Ah, how well you knew it. Ah, how well you know it. For it was you who escaped to freedom. Ah, yes, and you know the story. I saw him resting now, and beaming out across the chapel, his huge head turning to all its corners like a beacon. His voice still echoing as I fought back my emotion. For the first time, the evocation of the founder saddened me, and the campus seemed to rush past me, fast retreating, like the fading of a dream at the sundering of slumber. Beside me, the student's eyes swam with a distorting cataract of tears, his features rigid as though he struggled within himself. The fat man was playing upon the whole audience without the least show of exertion. He seemed completely composed, hidden behind his black lens glasses, only his mobile features gesturing his vocal drama. I nudged the boy beside me. "Who is he?" I whispered. He gave me a look of annoyance, almost of outrage. "Reverend Homer A. Barbie, Chicago," he said. Now the speaker rested his arm upon the lectern and turned towards Dr. Bledsoe. "You heard the bright beginning of the beautiful story, my friend, but there is the mournful ending. And perhaps in many ways the richer side, the setting of this glorious sun of the morning." He turned to Dr. Bledsoe. "It was a fateful day, Dr. Bledsoe, sir, if I may recall it to you. For we were there. Oh, yes, my young friends," he said, turning to face us again with a sad, proud smile. "I knew him well and loved him, and I was there. We had toured through several states to which he was carrying the message. The people had come to hear the prophet. The multitude had responded. The old-fashioned people, women in aprons and Mother Hubbards, of calico and gingham, men in their overalls and patch alpacas, a sea of upturned and puzzled faces looking out from beneath old battered straw hats and limp sunbonnets. For those who don't know, he is speaking of Booker T. Washington. They who had come by oxen and mule team and by walking long distances. It was the month of September, and unseasonably cold. He had spoken peace and confidence into their troubled souls, had set a star before them, and we were passing on to other scenes, still carrying the message. Ah, those days of ceaseless travel, those youthful days, those springtime days, fertile, blossomy, sun-filled days of promise. Ah, yes, those indescribably glorious days in which the founder was building the dream not only here in this then barren valley, but hither and yonder throughout the land, instilling the dream in the hearts of the people, erecting the scaffolding of a nation, broadcasting his message that fell like seed on fallow ground, sacrificing himself, fighting and forgiving his enemies of both complexions. Oh, yes, he had them, of both complexions. But going forward, filled with the importance of his message, filled with his dedicated mission, and in his zeal, perhaps in his moral in his mortal pride, ignoring the advice of his physician, I see in my mind's eye the fatal atmosphere of that jam-packed auditorium. The founder holds the audience within the gentle palm of his eloquence, rocking it, soothing it, instructing it, and there below, the rapt faces blushed by the glow of the big pot-bellied stove now turned cherry red with its glowing. Yes, the spellbound rose caught in the imperious truth of his message, and I hear now again the great humming hush as his voice reached the end of a mighty period. And one of the listeners, a snowy-headed man, leaps to his feet crying out, "To us what is to be done, sir? For God's sake, tell us. Tell us in the name of the son they snatched from me last week." And all through the room the voices are rising, imploring, "Tell us, tell us." And the founder is suddenly mute with tears. Old Barbie's voice rang out, as suddenly he made charged and incomplete movements about the platform, acting out his words. And I watched with a sick fascination, knowing part of the story, yet a part of me fighting against its sad, inevitable conclusion. And the founder pauses, then steps forward with his eyes spilling his great emotion. With his arm upraised, he begins to answer and totters. Then all in commotion, we rush forward and lead him away. The audience leaps to its feet in consternation, all in terror and turmoil, a moan and a sighing, until, like a clap of thunder, I hear Dr. Bledsoe's voice ring out whip-like with authority, a song of hope. And as we stretch the founder upon a bench to rest, I hear Dr. Bledsoe stomping out the time with mighty strokes upon the hollow platform, commanding not in words but in the great gut tones of his magnificent basso. Oh, wasn't he a singer? Isn't he a singer still today? And they stand, they calm, and with him they sing out against the tottering of their giant, sing out their long black songs of blood and bones, meaning hope of hardship and pain, meaning faith of humbleness and absurdity, meaning endurance of ceaseless struggle and darkness, meaning triumph. Ha! Barbie cried, slapping his hands. Ha! Singing verse after verse until the leader revived. Slap, slap of his hands, addressing them. Slap. My God, assured them that he was only tired of his ceaseless efforts. Yes, and dismissing them, sending each on his way rejoicing, giving each a parting handshake of fellowship. I watched Barbie pace in a semicircle, his lips compressed, his face working with emotion, his palms meeting but making no sound. Ah, those days in which he tilled his mighty fields. Those days in which he watched the crops take hold and grow. Those youthful, summery, sun-bright days. Barbie's voice sighed off in nostalgia. The chapel hardly breathed as he sighed deeply. Then I watched him produce a snowy handkerchief, remove his dark glasses and wipe his eyes. And through the increasing distance of my isolation, I watched the men in the seats of honor slowly shake their spellbound heads. Then Barbie's voice began again, disembodied now. and it was as though he had never paused, as though his words, reverberating within us, had continued their rhythmic flow, though their source was for a moment stilled. Oh, yes, my young friends, oh, yes. He continued with a great sadness. Man's hope can paint a purple picture, can transform a soaring vulture into a noble eagle or a moaning dove. Oh, yes, but I knew. He shouted, startling me. In spite of that great anguished hope within me, I knew that the great spirit was declining, was approaching its lonely winter, the great sun going down. For sometimes it is given one to know these things, and I staggered under the awful burden of that knowledge, and I cursed myself because I bore it. But such was the founder's enthusiasm. Oh, yes, that as we sped from country town to country town through the glorious Indian summer, I soon forgot. And then, and then, and then. I listened to his voice fall to a whisper. His hands were outspread as though he were leading an orchestra into a profound and final demi-innuendo. Then his voice rose again crisply, almost matter-of-factly accelerated. I remember the start of the train, how it seemed to groan as it started up the steep grade into the mountain. It was cold. Frost formed its icy patterns upon the window's edges, and the whistle of the train was long-drawn and lonely, a sigh ensuing from the depths of the mountain. In the car up ahead, in the Pullman assigned him by the very president of the line, the leader lay tossing. He had been struck with a sudden and mysterious sickness, and I knew in spite of the anguish within me that the sun goeth down, for the heavens themselves conveyed that knowledge. The rush of the train, the clicking of the wheels upon the steel. I remember how I looked out of the frosted pane and saw the looming great North Star, and lost it. And though the sky had shut its eye, the train was curving the mountain, the engine looping like a great black hound, parallel with the last careening cars, panting forth its pale white vapor as it hurled us ever higher. Shortly the sky was black without a moon, and his moon echoed over the chapel. He drew his chin against his chest while his white collar disappeared, leaving him a figure of balanced, unbroken blackness, and I could hear the rasp of air as he inhaled. It was as though the very constellations knew our impending sorrow. He bugled, his head raised to the ceiling, his voice full-throated. For against that great wide sweep of sable, there came the burst of a single jewel-like star, and I saw it shimmer and break and streak down the cheek of that cold, black sky like a reluctant and solitary tear. He shook his head with great emotion. His lips pursed, and he moaned, turning toward Dr. Bledsoe as though he did not quite see him. At that fateful moment, I sat with great precedent, I sat with great precedent. He was deep in meditation as we awaited word from the men of science. And he said to me of that dying star, Barbie, friend, did you see? And I answered, yes, doctor, I saw. And at our throats already we felt the cold hands of sorrow. And I said to Dr. Bledsoe, let us pray. And as we knelt there on the swaying floor, our words were less prayers than sounds of mute and terrible sorrow. And it was then, as we pulled our feet, staggering with the motion of that speeding train, that we saw the physician moving toward us. And we looked with bated breath into the blank and expressionless features of the man of science, asking with our total beings, do you bring us hope or disaster? And it was then and there he informed us that the leader was nearing his destination. It was said, the cruel blow had fallen and we were left numb, but the founder was still for the moment with us and still in command. And of all in the traveling party, he sent for him who sits there before you, and for me as a man of God, but he wanted mainly his friend of midnight consultations, his comrade of many battles, who over the weary years had remained steadfast in defeat as in victory. Even now I can see it, the dark passage lit with dim lights and Dr. Bledsoe swaying as he went before me. At the door stood the porter and the conductor, a black man and a white man of the South, both crying, both weeping, and he looked up as we entered, his great eyes resigned but still aflame with nobility and courage against the white of his pillow. And he looked at his friend and smiled warmly at his old campaigner, his loyal champion, his adjunct, that marvelous singer of the old songs who had rallied his spirit during times of distress and discouragement, who with his singing of the old familiar melodies soothed the doubts and fears of the multitude. He who had rallied the ignorant, the fearful and suspicious, those still wrapped in the rags of slavery, him, there your leader, who claimed the children of the storm. And as the founder looked up at his companion, he smiled, and reaching out his hand to his friend and companion, as I now stretch out my hand to you, he said, come closer. Come closer. And he moved closer until he stood beside the berth, and the light slanting across his shoulder as he knelt beside him, and the hand reached out and gently touched him, and he said, now you must take on the burden, lead them the rest of the way, and oh, the cry of that train and the pain too big for tears. When the train reached the summit of the mountain, he was no longer with us. And as the train dropped down the grade he had departed, it had become a veritable train of sorrow. Dr. Bledsoe there sat weary in mind and heavy of heart. What should he do? The leader was dead, and he, thrown suddenly at the head of the troops, like a cavalryman, catapulted into the saddle of his general, felled in a charge of battle, vaulted unto the back of his fiery and half-broken charger. Ah, and that great, black, noble beast, wall-eyed with the din of battle and twitching already with its sense of loss, what command should he give? Should he return with his burden home to where already the hot wire The hot wires were flashing, speaking, rattling the mournful message. Should he turn and bear the fallen soldier down the cold and alien mountain to this valley home? Return with the dear-eyed dulled, the firm hand stilled, the magnificent voice silent, the leader cold. Return to the warm valley, to the green grounds he could no longer light with his mortal vision. Should he follow his leader's vision, though he had now himself departed? Ah, of course, you know the story, how he bore the body into the strange city, and the speech he made as the leader lay in state, and how when the sad news spread, a day of mourning was declared for the whole municipality. Oh, and how rich and poor, black and white, weak and powerful, young and old all came to pay their homage. Many realizing the leader's worth and their loss only now with his passing. And how, with his mission done, Dr. Bledsoe returned, keeping his sorrowful vigil with his friend in a humble baggage car, and how the people came to pay their respects at the stations, a slow train, a sorrowful train, and all along the line, in mountain and valley, wherever the rails found their fateful course, the people were one in their common mourning, and like the cold steel rails, were spiked down to their sorrow. Oh, what a sad departure! And what an even sadder arrival. Foreshadowing. See with me, my young friends, hear with me the weeping and wailing of those who shared his labors. Their sweet leader returned to them, rock cold in the iron immobility of death. He who had left them quick, in the prime of his manhood, author of their own fire and illumination, returned to them cold, almost a bronzed statue. Oh, the despair, my young friends, the black despair of black people. I see them now, wandering about these grounds, where each brick, each bird, each blade of grass was a reminder of some precious memory, and each memory a hammer stroke driving home the blunt spikes of their sorrow. Oh, yes, some now are here gray-haired among you, still dedicated to his vision, still laboring in the vineyard, but then with the black draped coffin lying in state among them, inescapably reminding them they felt the dark night of slavery, settling once more upon them. They smelt that old obscene stink of darkness, that old slavery smell, worse than the rank halitosis of hoary death. Their sweet light enclosed in a black draped coffin, their majestic sun snatched behind a cloud. Oh, and the sad sound of weeping bugles. I can hear them now, stationed at the four corners of the campus, sounding taps for the fallen general, announcing and re-announcing the sad tidings, telling and retelling the sad revelation one to the other across the still numbness of the air, as though they could not believe it, could neither comprehend nor accept it. Weeping like a family of tender women, lamenting their loved one. And the people came to sing the old songs and express their unspeakable sorrow. Black, 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 black people in blacker mourning, the funeral crape hung upon their naked hearts, singing unashamedly their black folks' songs of sorrow, moving painfully, overflowing the curving walks, weeping and wailing beneath the drooping trees in their low murmuring voices like the moans of winds in a wilderness. And finally they gathered on the hill slope, and as far as the tear-wet eyes could see, they stood with their heads bowed and singing. Then silence, the lonesome hole banked with poignant flowers, the dozen white-gloved hands waiting taut upon the silk ropes. The awful silence. The final words are spoken. A single wild rose-tossed farewell bursts slowly, its petals drifting snow-like upon the reluctantly lowered coffin, then down into the earth, back to the ancient dust, back to the cold black clay, mother of us all. As Barbary paused, the silence was so complete that I could hear the power engines far across campus. Throbbing the night like an excited pulse. Somewhere in the audience, an old woman's voice began a plaintive wail, the birth of a sad, unformulated song that died stillborn in a sob. Barbie stood with his head thrown back, his arms rigid at his sides, his fists clenched as though fighting desperately for control. Dr. Bledsoe sat with his face in his hands. Near me, someone blew his nose. Barbie took a tottering step forward. Oh, yes, he said. Oh, yes, that too is part of the glorious story, but think of it not as a death, but as a birth. A great seed had been planted, a seed which has continued to put forth its fruit in its season as surely as if the great Creator had been resurrected. For in a sense he was, if not in the flesh, in the spirit, and in a sense in the flesh too. For has not your present leader become his living agent, his physical presence? Look about you if you doubt it. My young friends, my dear young friends. How can I tell you what manner of man this is who leads you? How can I convey to you how well he has kept his pledge to the founder, how conscientious has been his stewardship? First, you must see the school as it was, already a great institution to be sure, but then the buildings were 8, now they are 20. Then the faculty was 50, now it is 200. Then the student body was a few hundred, where now I'm told you are 3,000. And now, where you have roads of asphalt for the passage of rubber tires, then the roads were of crushed stone for the passage of oxen, and mule teams and horse-drawn wagons. I have not the words to tell you how my heart swelled to return to this great institution after so great a while, to move among its wealth of green things, its fruitful farmland and fragrant campus. And the marvelous plant supplying power to an area larger than many towns, all operated by black hands. Thus, my young friends, does the light of the founder still burn? Your leader has kept his promise 1,000-fold. I commend him in his own right, for he is the co-architect of a great and noble experiment. He is a worthy successor to his great friend, and it is no accident that his great and intelligent leadership has made him our leading statesman. His is a form of greatness worthy of your imitation. I say to you, patting yourselves upon him, aspire each of you to some day follow in his footsteps. Great deeds are yet to be performed, for we are a young, though a fast-rising people. Legends are still to be created, but be not afraid to undertake the burdens of your leader. and the work of the founder will be one of ever unfolding glory. The history of the race a saga of mounting triumphs. Barbie stood with his arms outstretched now, beaming over the audience, his Buddha-like body still as an onyx boulder. There was sniffling throughout the chapel. Voices murmured with admiration, and I felt more lost than ever. For a few minutes, old Barbie had made me see the vision, and I now knew that leaving the campus would be like the parting of flesh. I watched him lower his arms now and start back to his chair, moving slowly with his head cocked as though listening to distant music. I had lowered my head to wipe my eyes when I heard the shocked gasp arise. Looking up, I saw two of the white trustees moving swiftly across the platform where Barbie floundered upon Dr. Bledsoe's legs. The old man slid forward upon his hands and knees as the two white men took his arms, and now as he stood, I saw one of them reach for something on the floor and place it in his hands. It was when he raised his head that I saw it. For a swift instant between the gesture and the opaque glitter of his glasses, I saw the blinking of sightless eyes. Homer A. Barbie was blind. Uttering apologies, Dr. Bledsoe helped him to his chair. Then, as the old man rested back with a smile, Dr. Bledsoe walked to the edge of the platform and lifted his arms. If you are reformed, you know what he was doing. I closed my eyes as I heard the deep moaning sound that issued from him, and the rising crescendo of the student body joining in. This time it was music, sincerely felt, not rendering for the guests, but for themselves, a song of hope and exaltation. I wanted to rush from the building, but didn't dare. I sat stiff and erect, supported by the hard bench, relying upon it as upon a form of hope. I could not look at Dr. Bledsoe now, because old Barbie had made me both feel my guilt and accept it. For although I had not intended it, any act that endangered the continuity of the dream was an act of treason. I did not listen to the next speaker, a tall white man who kept dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief and repeating his phrases in an emotional and inarticulate manner. Then the orchestra played excerpts from Dvorak's New World Symphony, and I kept hearing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, resounding through its dominant theme, my mother's and grandmother's favorite spiritual. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. But a band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. It was more than I could stand, and before the next speaker could begin, I hurried past the disapproving eyes of teachers and matrons out into the night. A mockingbird trilled a note from where it perched upon the hand of the moonlit founder, flipping its moon-mad tail above the head of the eternally kneeling slave. I went up the shadowy drive, heard it trill behind me the street lamps glowed brilliant in the moonlight dream of the campus, each light serene in its cage of trees, of shadows. I might well have waited until the end of the services, for I hadn't gone far, when I heard the dim, bright notes of the orchestra striking up a march, followed by a burst of voices as the students filed out into the night. With a feeling of dread, I hurried from the administration building, and upon reaching it, stood in the darkened hallway. My mind fluttered like the moths that veiled the street lamp, which cast shadows upon the bank of grass below me. I would now have my real interview with Dr. Bledsoe. And I recalled Barbie's address with resentment. With such words fresh in my mind, I was sure Dr. Bledsoe would be far less sympathetic to my plea. I stood in the darkened doorway, trying to probe my future if I were expelled. Where would I go? What would I do? How could I ever return home? Gone with the Wind.